On last week's video, I talked about the reasons why I started film photography in 2023. So if that's what you're wondering about, or if you're considering to pick up a film camera and start shooting film yourself, then last week's video is what you should go and watch first. Afterwards, when you're done, you can come back to watch this week's video where I'll talk about how my film camera, my Canon EOS 500, actually works. Here it is, the Canon EOS 500. It's a 35mm film camera which was produced by Canon from 1993 to 1996, and later on it was replaced by the 500N, which was a slightly more advanced version. I got this camera because it was very cheap, it was in a very good working condition, it came with all of these accessories that you can see here, and I didn't want a very advanced version of the camera, so the 500N didn't really interest me. Canon introduced the EF mount back in 1987 when they switched to the electro-optical system, or the EOS cameras, which had autofocus, unlike the previous system which was the FD mount and had the manual connection between the lens and the camera, and also had no autofocus. This EOS 500 has only one autofocusing system in the center though, so if your subject is not in the center, then you have to do the whole point to your subject, focus and then reframe and then take the picture kind of movement. But if you come from old DSLRs, then you're probably familiar with that. Although I have to say, at least with this 28-105 f3.5 to 4.5 EF lens, the autofocusing performance is really good. When it comes to the body, it only weighs 370 grams. It has these dimensions, and for reference, that's what it looks like next to my other cameras, the 500D, the EOS R and the R6 Mark II. As you can see, this camera is very thin, but it also has a very small grip which makes it quite uncomfortable to carry around. On the plus side though, it's very lightweight. It uses two CR or DL123A batteries. If you're wondering about how to load a film into this camera because you've never done that before, which is like I was, I'm gonna walk you through it. It's a very simple process. Let's start by pushing the film latch up on the left of the camera for the film door to open. You can actually see the shutter here in the middle, but you should be very careful not to touch it because it's very fragile. The camera has two chambers, one in the left and one in the right. The chamber on the left is where the film cartridge goes. You have to turn the cartridge so that the sticking out part is pointing down. Make sure to put this orange plastic part that sticks out inside of the hole of the film and rotate the cartridge until the extension is parallel to the back of the camera. Now pull the film out of the cartridge until it reaches this orange line on the other side, and then let it hang freely inside the second chamber. As soon as you close the lid and turn the camera on, it will start advancing the entire film onto the second chamber, and then one by one, as you take the photos, it will start rewinding it back into the chamber, and once you've done the last shot, it will also rewind the leftover film, and then you're ready to open it again and take the cartridge out. That's all there is to it. If for some reason you want to or you have to rewind the whole film inside of the cartridge before you've done with your 36 shots, then you should just move the dial to this last position here and then just press and hold this button for at least 1 second, and then the camera will start rewinding the whole film back into the cartridge. The rewind button also works as a self-timer button. If you press it once, then you can see the clock sign appear on the LCD screen. Then you know that when you press the shutter to take the photo, it's going to start doing the beep noise that also the modern cameras do to tell you that in 10 seconds it will take the shot. And then if you just want to stop it before you waste your shot, just press the button again. This camera also has a light bulb here in the front as well as a built-in flash. If you want to activate the built-in flash, then you have to press this other button that is here at the front. And then if you don't want to use it anymore, you just press it down. If you press this button again, then it activates the red eye reduction mode. So when you're taking pictures of people, it can happen that their eyes turn red, and the way this mode works is by sending a beam of light prior to releasing the shutter. That beam of light touches their eyes, which makes their pupils shrink, and when the pupil is smaller, then the likelihood of red eyes decreases. It's a very interesting technology to see implemented in the camera this old. Be aware though, you shouldn't keep the red eye reduction button always on, because that mode actually introduces a delay of about 1 second from the moment that you press the shutter to the moment that it's actually released in the camera and the photo is taken. The mode dial has the usual manual and automatic modes that we also know from today's cameras. If you want to turn this camera off, you just have to rotate the mode dial to the L position. That's it. The green rectangle and the P on both sides of the L are the two automatic modes. Here the camera decides the shutter speed and the aperture automatically. If you put it in portrait mode, the camera tries to choose wider apertures to give you a shallow depth of field to separate your subjects, your people that you're taking the portraits of from the background. If you put it into landscape mode, then it tries to keep smaller apertures so that there is more depth of fields and more things that you can see in the photo. The close-up mode focuses the lens as close as possible to get the most magnification for your subject. If you switch to the sport mode, the camera tries to keep the shutter speed high so that it can freeze fast moving subjects. It can even do continuous shooting, and I think the speed is about 1 frame per second. On the other side of the L we have TV, which means time value, which means here you can select the shutter speed yourself, but the aperture is selected automatically by the camera. You have AV, which is aperture value, which means you can set the aperture but the camera sets the shutter speed. You have manual mode where you have full control of everything, and then you have A-Deep, which is a mode that tries to keep everything in focus from the foreground to the background. Next we have the beeper mode, that is the beep that you hear after the camera successfully focuses somewhere. If you put it in this mode, then on the screen here you'll see a number 1, which means that this function is turned on, and then you can just turn it off by turning the dial. Unlike digital cameras where the ISO is another variable that helps you expose the photo correctly, on film the ISO is actually a constant because it is built in the film. I use, for example, Portra 160, and that means the ISO of my film is 160. And that's a number that you should register to your camera. If your film is DX coded, this camera can actually automatically read it, but if your film isn't DX coded, then you have to go to this mode and set it yourself so that the metering of light can work correctly. And the last mode is the rewind mode, which we already talked about. Now moving on the back of the camera we have 2 more buttons. So when you are in manual mode, it's very straightforward to change the shutter speed. Like in every other camera, you just rotate this dial here at the front. However, this camera doesn't have a second dial to change the aperture. So the way you change the aperture is by actually pressing the right button here and holding it while rotating this dial. For all the modes on this zone, except for the manual mode, you can actually do an exposure compensation by pressing and holding the right button and then just switching the dial. That means your camera will automatically adjust the exposure, not for it to be correctly in the middle, but to be over or underexposed to your liking. The button on the left is used for partial metering. If you have a very high contrast scene, using the normal metering of the camera can actually cause you some problems, because how that works is that it captures different values from the entire frame and then it gives you an average of all. In those cases, it's actually important to meter the specific zones so that you know how much tolerance you can give by overexposing or underexposing depending on your scene. In order to do that, you use partial metering, and with the help of this button you can only meter the center of the frame. It works by pointing to a subject and then you do a normal metering, so half press the shutter button and then you release it. Afterwards you press and hold this button. That will give you a reading of only the center of the frame. So you can just point the center of the frame to a subject where you want to get a metering from, and then by keeping this button pressed you can move the shutter speed up or down to fix the exposure for that subject. The last feature I want to talk about, believe it or not, is that this camera has multiple exposures. The way it works is that you can press both of these buttons at the same time, and then you can select the number of exposures that you want for each frame. The maximum you can do per frame is 9 exposures. So that was the Canon EOS 500. It's a very user-friendly camera, which makes starting with film photography very easy. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.